Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Russell Guay. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome to the Faculty and Staff Ethics Interview Series. Today's guest is Drew Conrad. Drew is the director of the Institute for Decision Making at UNI for the last 5.5 years. He's been at UNI for a total of 28 years. He's a bachelor's from Mary Crest College, and his master's is in public policy from UNI. He's got several different economic development certifications as well. And today we're going to talk about the ethics code through the International Economic Development Council, which, if I remember correctly, was formed in the aftermath of several questionable practices following Hurricane Katrina. So Drew, thank you very much for being here and welcome to our show.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So let's go ahead and jump into that. Like I said, I know you're heavily involved in the economic development area for several groups right now. And so let's jump into some of the ethics code implications that Katrina had brought about for one of your groups.
Yeah, I'm a member of the International Economic Development Council, which is the largest professional association of economic development professionals around, actually globally.
Okay.
And one of the aftermaths of Katrina in our profession, there was a number of communities, economic development organizations who feasted on the bad economic effects on New Orleans and Louisiana and the Gulf Coast area by trying and attracting businesses out of that region. And because of that, our profession decided, okay, that's unethical in the practices. And an outgrowth of that was the development of a code of ethics. And now that has obviously been in place here for 15 years or so. And those of us in the profession who are, and you mentioned certifications, I am a certified economic developer, which several other staff members on my team are.
Sure.
And every 3 years, we have to sit through an ethics course related to that. And, it's not only just, I think Katrina was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back that caused our profession to put in a code of ethics. But there's other things. If you look, there's 12 points within the code of ethics. And if you look at it, it's also particularly economic developers who work with businesses a lot, whether it's a business expansion project or a relocation project or an entrepreneur starting a business. The whole idea around confidentiality of protecting their interest if they're negotiating a deal. And so, so the code of ethics also focuses on that. And it also focuses on the public good.
Absolutely.
Because much economic development is funded in part through public financing and public funding. And so one of the tenets of the code of ethics is if you're at the local level or state level and working in any way in the public with the public sector, is keeping those community elected officials, state elected officials that you work with informed as best you can. And obviously that is a fine line you have to walk, because you also under your code of ethics have to protect the confidentiality of that business you're working with.
Absolutely.
So there's an interesting dynamic. So I think Katrina was kind of, like I said, is what the event that pushed our profession into this, but I think there's other practices going back to kind of when economic development really started in the US. And some people would say it started in an unethical behavior of southern states, particularly the state of Mississippi, poaching companies out of the Northeast during the Depression. So, some say our foundation of the economic development profession was unethical. So
that's a very interesting point. I agree. Yeah, we're working on, not that this has anything to do with the economic side, but speaking of the codes of ethics and things, we've just put out a new one for the business students too recently. One of the student orgs had worked on that for us. So now it's starting to release some of that and seeing what kind of effect that might have with some of our students. We're hosting a student ethics panel later tonight with 10 students talking about academic ethics and workplace ethics in the business world for them. So these codes of ethics definitely hot topics for our students right now, whether in the classroom or their jobs, their professional experience too. So very timely topic here for us today.
Yeah, it's interesting with the advancement of technology. It's it's much easier, whether it's a student or anyone, to be, in my opinion, be more unethical.
Sure.
It makes it easier to take unethical behavior.
That's very true. And yeah, one of the effects with the pandemic, with several of the classes having that Zoom focus, whether it was temporary or whether some of the classes still going that direction, certainly there's a lot more corners that can be cut, unfortunately, from that standpoint too. So I'm trying to combat some of those obstacles and hurdles over the long term too, because I think for at least some programs, online classes in some way, shape, or form are probably here to stay as well. So yeah, I agree. So the effects from the code of ethics for your group then, I mean, obviously it's been beneficial on there. Kind of talk about what it was like before the code of ethics to now. So how much of a positive impact maybe this has had?
I think that it's at least reined in some behavior of rogue communities, rogue regions, rogue economic developers, from the standpoint of at least causing them to stop and think about, wait a second, if you look at, I'm focusing on a community that is, we'll use our own example of, back in 2008 when Parkersburg was hit by an EF5 tornado.
Absolutely.
Other communities could have, and probably some did, approach businesses that were negatively impacted to say, hey, we can get you up and running in our community and in a short period of time. Well, that, I think the code of ethics at least is requiring or forcing economic development professionals to at least stop and think about it. And if you do violate it, you can be censured. There has been every year, there's a number of cases that have been brought before the International Economic Development Council, and those individuals have been censured. So I think from that standpoint, it at least causes us to think about it and hopefully take the appropriate action. But we are human, so obviously,
of course,
we don't always do the right thing, unfortunately.
And I teach leadership and I teach negotiations, and that's one of the things I have to try to get through with the students pretty quickly is they have this, I don't know where it's coming from, that this pressure, they need to be perfect all the time, and mistakes are crucial in everything. And I pretty much start the semester telling them, look, in the leadership class, look, I've probably made more mistakes than all of you combined. You need to learn from it. You need to bounce back, move forward from there. And that's the key. But certainly you're the only person that expects you to be perfect. So we need to kind of get past that hurdle. And yeah, I mean, at the same time, I'm not telling them it's okay to break laws and it's okay to be unethical, but certainly we know we're all going to fall short from time to time of where we wish we were.
Yeah, a mentor of mine as an undergrad, who was, I might add, is a Cubs fan, said, God does not require success, only an earnest effort.
Okay.
And so, and I think that was the point that she was making, is you can't always get it right. And part of it is life's experience.
And I'm one of those Cub fans too.
So am I.
I enjoyed the 5-year run lately. I think we've got some work to do now, unfortunately. But as you know, that's been most of our lives. We've had work to do as Cub fans.
Yes.
But that's another story, I guess. Yeah. What about other aspects within your position? So with the Institute of Decision Making or through BCS, or what kind of ethical implications and things do you have to contend with on a regular basis in some of your other
Well, one of the things is in the work that we do with communities and economic development organizations, we facilitate a lot of strategic planning processes.
Exactly.
And so in those processes, as so let's say a Chamber of Commerce or Regional Economic Development Group, as they're deciding what their activities are going to be, what their priorities are going to be in the next 3 to 5 years, let's say, thinking about it from an ethical standpoint, not doing practices of poaching businesses or labor.
Right.
Another thing is right now, workforce is a huge issue.
That's an understatement.
Yeah, and it has been for a number of years. I mean, this is, COVID just really magnified the issue. But in economic development, particularly in the upper Midwest, for the last 5-6 years, we've been dealing with that issue. And so you look at it from the standpoint of also recruiting workers and recruiting people to come to your community.
Right.
Once again, is there's an ethical quandary there from the standpoint of, whether it's recruiting individuals from Puerto Rico, let's say, after, they were negatively impacted by the hurricanes a couple of years ago. So thinking about those strategies in the planning process of, okay, helping that client step back and say, wait a second, are these economic development strategies that we're considering implementing, are they ethical? Or
Sure.
are we, and it's not always an easy decision. And oftentimes people don't look at it from that lens. And so that's the thing, oftentimes the voice we bring, and it's not something we, deal on a daily basis,
Right.
but we do, right. It's more of making them think through, okay, what are the impacts? And, I always look at it from the standpoint of putting myself in the shoes of that other person or that community. How would I feel like it if someone swooped into Waterloo Cedar Falls, if let's say we were very negatively impacted
Sure.
by a natural disaster and try to poach businesses and workers? I would have some sour grapes with that. So,
absolutely.
So that's the one thing is the role that we play in that facilitator role and technical assistance role is just helping them kind of think things through from a third party perspective.
Okay, good. And speaking of the strategic planning process, I know through you and I, you're quite busy with that process right now too.
Yes, I am.
What's the pandemic effect there? So is anybody just kind of pushing back on, whether here or elsewhere with strategic plans you're doing, pushing back on, we can't even think about tomorrow right now with the uncertainty of the pandemic. It's impossible to think about 5 years from now.
The interesting thing is we are busy as ever because that was the first, I would say the first 6 to 9 months.
Okay.
So probably through 2020.
Okay.
And then after the first of the year, we really, even the fall of a year ago, we got really busy because I think a lot of people kind of adjusted, both individuals and organizations and communities adjusted to the new normal. And so from that standpoint, it's kind of like, okay, we can't, we can put things on pause for 6 months, but we can't, we got to learn to adapt because the world changes so quickly. And so that's the interesting thing from that standpoint is the amount of planning projects that we are doing with clients from large and small communities to organizations right now. I think a lot of people are, they've kind of figured out, okay, we got to deal with COVID. We got to deal with the pandemic and there's issues that we need to address and we got to move forward.
Yeah. And leadership should never really be a status quo approach anyway. There's always continuous improvement we can focus on in some aspect or another. So if anything, just the uncertainty that the pandemic has brought us, at least I think has given us new perspective on that we're always trying to move forward, always trying to be innovative and creative and come up with better approaches out here.
Yeah, no, I agree. And as I said earlier, the COVID pandemic really just shined a light on a lot of issues that our clients were dealing with, workforce, the whole childcare issue, broadband issue, transportation, housing. So, it's kind of right now, I'd say that's the four-legged stool of our workforce barriers in the state of Iowa. And so it's forcing kind of, I guess, greater action than, so a lot of these things, people were trying to work on it before. If you look locally, the Blackhawk County Child Care Coalition had been in existence for several years. It was started by the United Way, our regional economic development group, and a number of employers and other organizations. So, even pre-COVID, we were trying to address that. Broadband was a huge issue. So, so from that standpoint, I think it's, there was some uniquenesses or some new problems that surfaced out of the pandemic that impacted businesses and communities, but it really just turned the light up.
Good. I'm glad to hear that because I wasn't sure if there'd be some pushback to the thought of trying to plan too strategically and too far in advance or not. So that's good to hear that it's actually had the opposite effect on people. Mm-hmm. What about for students or for whoever might be watching these students, community members, any takeaways you'd want them to be thinking about as they start their careers in the business world? Any ethical takeaways from your perspective you'd want to share?
Well, I guess from my perspective is because we work with, a variety of organizations and a variety of communities is you need to always have the ethical lens in front of you, whether you're a volunteer board member on a nonprofit organization in the community or in the workplace. And also, as you look at your own, student, your own career development moving forward, I think,
Right.
I just think it's important to keep that focused in front of you, and always have it in the back of your mind of questioning, okay, is this right or is this wrong?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's not always an easy answer
No.
to that particular question. I mean, I guess that's where the term ethical dilemma comes from in the first place, that we can see both sides. We might know which one is the right path, but it doesn't always make that choice easy necessarily either. So, yeah. Any other topics you'd like to dive into today?
Not really. I mean, I think I'm glad you're doing the series. I think, different perspectives, because, your perspective as a faculty member or a student's perspective is different from mine, because
Absolutely.
most of my work is outward facing in communities. And so I think having those different perspectives from, I think you said you had, a dozen or more people participating in these, I think it'll be probably some common themes, but also coming at it from different angles.
Right. I would agree completely with that. There's some topics that most of people have gotten into a little bit, but then it's also been very diverse from that perspective too. And I mean, even the faculty, I mean, several of the people have been faculty members, and even our views are very different from one another at times too, whether in the same department or not. So I think there's been 4 or 5 people I've talked to in the management department where I'm at, and even our approaches to ethics and teaching this topic and whatnot is quite a bit different from each other. So yeah, I think that people watching these can learn something from each and every one of these that we've recorded so far. It's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Well, Drew, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking your time. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Rusty.
Thank you.